Okay, everybody, welcome back to the penultimate presentation of Casual Connect 2013 in Hamburg. Next to speak is Florian from TradeMob. If you've been here today, you'll have noticed there's been a theme throughout all of this afternoon, in fact, even this morning, that we're in a data-driven world. Analytics is sort of key, A/B testing, a way of the rich getting richer and having a very tight feedback loop. Being number one, or being 1 through 10 is so much better than being 11 through 20 or 21 through 30. So to help us explain how to get to number one, here's Florian.
Thank you. Well, as everybody knows, it's actually 1 to 4, much more than 1 to 10, but it's quite obvious, I guess. So thanks for the introduction. Today we're going to speak about how you actually use data and technology in order to drive your user acquisition, basically by decreasing cost and increasing the value of users that you're actually generating. So I'm going to lead you through some basic knowledge regarding traffic buying modes. We're going to speak about how to set up a strategy, and actually I'm going to show you a very brief case study of how it could work, not in theory, but in practical. So first of all, there's basically 3 different types or modes of buying media. One is obviously CPC, then we've got CPI, and there's also a pretty brilliant model nowadays, which is more or less a flat model where you buy a placement media for a given time, so probably 24 hours or a week or a day or something like that. So CPC obviously is today the dominant way of buying mobile media. It's established also in the online world, and I obviously know, or I think you all know what it's all about. It's basically buying media by the click. So the advantages of buying media CPC is that obviously you have a vast volume of traffic that you can plug into. So it's basically unlimited, right? On the other hand, it's also very easy to buy, and nowadays it does have pretty good targeting mechanisms. You can actually get very granular by buying CPC media. On the other hand, what you really want to achieve is obviously not a click, so the risk actually stays on your side. What you see if you look at the mobile ecosystem today is that there's so many different providers of cost per click campaigns that it actually gets very intransparent. And in fact, what we're seeing is that most of the networks that you can plug into today actually use more or less the same traffic, which is kind of annoying, because if you end up buying traffic from all of them, you will effectively bid against yourselves. And that's obviously something that you have to stop doing. Also, and that's also not a surprise because it's apparent in online advertising as well, there's quite a high rate of click fraud in CPC campaigns, and that's obviously something you need to be aware of as well. So alternatively, and that's what most of the games guys seem to be doing today, they're plugging into CPI networks. Obviously CPI, cost per install or cost per activation or cost per download, whatever you want to call it, is a very attractive way because it pours the risk of media budgets away from the advertiser and towards the networks, because you pay only if you achieve an actual download, which is good. On the other hand, networks today, such as many of the networks you do are offering more and more and better way of targeting users. Specifically for games, it's actually quite a convenient way to acquire new users, because most of the CPI networks that we know today are actually games networks themselves. So it's basically targeting gamers in order to download more games. It's quite a no-brainer, and obviously that works quite good. On the other hand, most of the CPI traffic you can buy today is incentivized traffic, whereas incentivized means that the user is being offered a certain credit or some credit points or whatever, or a special feature in their game, if they agree to download your app. So apparently, most of these users who will effectively download your app are not really interested in your game in the first place, but actually more in the credits that they're getting from the game they're currently in. Then again, traffic sources are usually unknown, so that's also that might be difficult for some games. But the biggest problem we're seeing with CPI networks is actually that it's very hard to scale. So the volumes you can drive using CPI networks is still very low. So what we're doing in order to improve that situation is we're plugging in not with just one, but we're plugging in with all of them, And obviously, we just have one SDK that helps you to use all different CPI networks, and that makes your life much easier. And that's basically what I mean if I'm saying it's not easy to buy, because if you want to buy CPI, you need some sort of measurement implemented in your app that helps you to actually count the installs that you need. And the only way to achieve that today in an app is actually by using an SDK that helps you track that. So the last type of media I want to speak to you about is fixed placements. And I'm sure you know the guys like AppGratis and AppTurbo. These guys are driving myriads of downloads, very high numbers of downloads within just one day, which is brilliant and has a massive impact on rankings, which again drives your organic downloads and all of that. So it seems quite cool in the first place. Also, effectively, they have very good effective CPI costs. So if you work with one of these discovery apps, you will effectively end up with very low effective CPI, way below $1, which is quite attractive. On the other hand, you have very little transparency. You have no ways to target specific users. You have no transparency in how many downloads did you actually generate by paying that fixed placement, and how many of these downloads did effectively come from the organic uplift that resulted in the increased ranking. Also, these platforms are not scalable as well. They're pretty big, and you can drive massive downloads within just one day, but you can't do the same thing the next week again, because then the same user base will either not be interested any longer, or they already have your app. So that's not a way to really drive downloads over time, and it's also a very short periods of time. So that's not an option if you actually want to drive users or drive user acquisition over time and improve of the values that you're generating. So the basic idea of app marketing and user acquisition obviously is to develop a strategy that uses all three of these different media kinds very smartly and knowledgeable in order to yield the maximum effect for you with the minimum budgets that you're implementing. So what we're doing when we're saying define a strategy is actually, first of all, obviously, you need to be sure about the targets that you actually want to have, right? Your targets are not investing $20,000 or generating 100,000 downloads. Your target should be more like generating 100,000 downloads in the US who are effectively driving a certain amount of revenue. And that's really the stuff that we want to talk about. And then in order to measure those targets, you obviously need to implement some very granular KPIs that help you to keep track of your progress in terms of reaching your targets. In order to track them, obviously you need some tracking. And then also, based on this knowledge that you get from your tracking, you need to define and improve your campaign planning. So first step, obviously, is define targets. And because I think I don't have so much time as I wanted to have, let's run through that quickly, because I think you guys know your targets better than I do. But obviously think more in terms of increase the number of active users that you have, rather than just think in terms of I want to drive 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 downloads. A download is nothing. It's not even an activation. If you see the downloads that are reported in your iTunes Connect reports, they just count the click on the download button, not the actual activation of the app. That's something to be aware of. So I'd rather have you guys think in terms of smart KPIs that help you to define what really is an active user, and how can I define very early in the customer journey that a user is active. So some things that you might be tracking is, for instance, a registration or a completion of certain levels, or if a user have watched a video or something like that. And this will help you to define that these users you're acquiring short-term will be active long-term, and then you can obviously use this data in order to target these users as soon as possible. In order to achieve that, or in order to actually track what you're doing, obviously you will need tracking. And the things we're tracking is not only clicks, but it's actual cost per install, it's actual cost per engagement, cost per in-app purchase, cost per registration, and you can see all that in your campaign reports. So tracking is actually quite a fascinating thing, because tracking in mobile apps today is I wouldn't say in its infancy, but it's still pretty much a new thing that people start talking about. All the bigger networks, all the CPI networks obviously, and also the large global networks nowadays offer tracking solutions which you can use. The problem is, if you do opt for that, you will actually end up implementing 10, 20 different SDKs in order to run a global campaign, which is a massive pain in the butt, to be honest. And also, it's actually a usability issue in the end of the day. So the other thing is that obviously all of these different tracking mechanisms tend to be incorrect in one way or the other. And they tend not really to compare to each other. For instance, if you implement an InMobi tracking code on the one hand, and also you implement, say Google tracking code on the other hand, and both drive a click, right? So I'm a user and I see an ad from InMobi here. I click on it and decide, nice ad, but I'm not going to download it right now. Next time I see the same ad, but this time not from InMobi, but from Google. Once again, I'm going to click on the ad and say, okay, now this is really cool. I've seen this the second time, so I'm going to download it. What will effectively happen in your report is that both InMobi and Google will claim the download. So this is going to mess up your reports at the end of the day. If you have a single tracking SDK that tracks everything for you, things are not only much easier, but they're also much more accurate. And in order to really improve your campaign, in order to use the data that you're generating from tracking, you will need to be accurate, or elsewise you will do the wrong, the wrong allocations and the wrong marketing decisions, which is obviously not good. So introducing the different types of tracking technologies, there's obviously 3 or 4 major types of tracking. Same with buying tracking, same with buying traffic. Most of them do have some pros and some cons. The major way of tracking today is basically by using device IDs, which has some privacy issues attached to it, but the major problem with device IDs is that device IDs are not available for all traffic sources. In fact, if you're plugging into CPC today, you can see that not more than maybe 30% of all traffic sources do actually give you a device ID, so you can't track using device IDs. The other option you have is a fingerprinting, which is quite smart. But fingerprinting, on the other hand, is not very accurate. It tends to be maximum 60 to maybe 80% accurate. So again, fingerprinting will lead to wrong budget allocations. And then we have cookie tracking, which is a cool thing because everybody knows cookie tracking from online. But cookie trackings are pretty nasty actually in apps because an app itself can't neither drop or read a cookie. So effectively, you will have to open up a browser window in order to read out the cookie. And that, in some instances, might look pretty weird for your user. So that's not really what we recommend. We've actually developed a completely entirely new tracking technology which does not have the weaknesses of cookies that need to be dropped and read out in the browser device. So that's obviously something we can talk about more in more detail if you want. So once you've set up tracking, once you know your KPIs, and once you really have made up your mind of what you really want to reach, you need to define and develop a campaign plan. And a campaign planning actually is obviously an iterative step. So it's something that happens in a circle, right? So you have your targets, you define timing, you define channels, you allocate your budgets right, and then obviously you make estimations of how many downloads will you actually achieve, what ranking will you achieve from those downloads generated, and what impact this will have on your organic increases. And once you've made these estimations, you will obviously go into a final loop to adjust your planning and maybe decide, maybe I need some more budget in specific countries in order to achieve a better ranking, and maybe I can decrease my budgets in other countries because after all, I will get up in the ranking anyways. So I'm going to introduce to you 2 different standard generic solutions in how to do a campaign plan. The first is a short-term solution, which is more targeted into driving downloads fast and increasing your ranking. And the second one, obviously, is a more long-term solution, which helps you to drive downloads over time and not so much increase or improve your install KPIs, but more the long-term KPIs in terms of customer lifetime value and average return per user. So short-term solution is something that we call smartBoost, basically depending on the large and powerful discovery apps, which in one day basically cost you a lot of budget, but also increase very much the downloads that you're buying. because you're buying so many downloads on that way, your ranking will improve massively. And once you're up into the top 4, and that's obviously where you want to get, you will effectively see a massive rise in organic downloads. So that's something you can do yourself, right? You don't even need tracking for that, because if you plug into AppGratis today, they will pump you up, almost guaranteed. The problem occurs because obviously the next day you will smash down the same way as you've risen up. So it's not really a solution. So what we're trying to do is we're obviously trying to maximize the amount of organic uplift over time. So obviously once we have you up here and say a top 3 placement, we can't keep you up there forever. But we can use some budget allocated smartly between CPI and CPC campaigns, which we are spending more or less opportunistically in order to measure, okay, how many downloads do we have currently and how many more do we need to improve our ranking or to keep our ranking at a certain level. So effectively, we'll keep you up at the top 10 or top 20 placement for at least a couple of days, so you maximize the amount of organic download. So that's really why we call it a smart boost and not just a boost, because it's smart, because it's driven by actual real-time data and it's driven by the technology-guided marketing allocation decisions. The long-term solution is obviously much more difficult because it's guided by more data. It needs to be run over time, and it has a much more massive, it has much harder allocation decisions. So effectively what you're doing for a long-term campaign is you start collecting data, and we're talking massive data, right? We're not talking some downloads, some clicks, we're talking really massive global data that launches on, or that is collected on our platform. So effectively, what you do by using this data is that you're using this data in order to make marketing decisions in real time. Some of these decisions you could actually take yourself, right? If you're seeing, okay, network A is performing quite well, network B is not performing at all, quite easy, you're shifting budgets away from network A to network B. And that gives you quite a good chance of, increasing your average CPI by quite good value. The next one then actually requires technology and data, because you will need to look at click fraud. That's something we've talked about before, and we're seeing that the rate of click fraud in the performance networks today is actually quite high. So if you have a means of identifying click fraud in time and avoiding click fraud while your campaign is already running, then you're actually saving quite a lot of money in real time, and that's something we're doing for you as well. The next level requires actually quite a lot of workload, because once you have decided of how to allocate your budgets between different networks, you will actually need to start making allocation decisions not between networks but between different publishers, and we're talking thousands of publishers for each country. So that's actually something that either requires massive manual workload, or it requires a technology that does this decisioning for you. And then this gets even worse when it gets over time that actually you start playing around with very granular targeting mechanisms, such as time of day, day of week. Devices in Android are very interesting to target. You can start targeting by different network carriers. For instance, here in Germany, you can see that buying traffic from E+ or O2 is actually much cheaper than buying traffic from T-Online and Vodafone. And apparently these users don't perform much worse when it comes to games. So it's sometimes very valuable to think about carriers as well. So at the end of the day, you're actually making millions, actually billions of different targeting decisions within just minutes. And that's something that you can't do yourself. That's something that needs to be driven by technology. So we're actually saying once you've set your campaign to autopilot over time, what will effectively happen is that first of all, obviously, technology is guiding your decision on how to allocate your budgets between the 3 different modes of buying, but we're also shifting budgets back and forth between different networks, between different publishers, and also between all the different targeting parameters that we have. And what you will see over time is that your cost of user acquisition is going down, and at the same time the average value of users are going up if you have the same, if you have the right tracking and KPIs implemented. And that's what we do as a platform for you. Giving you an example of that, and that's an example for a short-term campaign. So I don't know how many of you are from Germany. Wordblitz is basically a casual game. It has a fairly broad target group, and it also has a very smart viral component which helps it to increase its users, and it's actually very sticky. So that's the perfect campaign basically to run a smartBoost, and obviously we've done that for them, and I'm going to show you the type of results we've achieved. Interesting, that's the first time I see the slide. So, but I think it's quite easy to see. So we basically did the smartBoost for Wordblitz when it first launched. And that's actually quite a smart decision because the iOS rankings are more or less determined by sheer number of downloads. So for instance, if you need, say, 12,000 downloads to achieve a top 10 ranking in Germany, then it's very easy to buy those 12,000 downloads. Now, on the first day after the actual release or the actual update in the App Store of an app, Apple effectively seems to count or to value each new download with a factor of 1.2 for the calculation of the rankings. So effectively, if you need 12,000 downloads in order to come up to top 10, you will need to buy only 10,000 because Apple will count them as 12,000. So that's quite cool. So that's one of the mechanisms we did for this app. And what happened is we boost them up into a very good ranking. And the funny thing is it stayed over there for a very long time. And you all know what it means to rank top 5 or top 10 or even top 20 in the overall ranking in the App Store. It drives massive downloads over time. And this is a very good example of how we could achieve that, not just for a few days, but actually for almost 3 weeks. So the total numbers, obviously this campaign has been run in Germany. The maximum ranking we've achieved is a top 7 ranking. The funny thing is it stayed up there, not at top 7, but in top 10 for a very long time. And the total numbers of downloads we've bought was actually 18,600. You all know just about how much that costs. But the number of total installs we've generated over the time where we have invested effectively was more than 130,000. And effectively that was driving the total average campaign CPI to just below 30 euro cents, which is actually ridiculous if you think about the average user cost in Germany. So I think I'm pretty good in time, and I'm perfect. So I'm done, and I'm very much looking forward to a good discussion, hopefully.
So do we have any questions for Florian? Well, maybe I'll start. If you have an application that's available in multiple languages, you've talked about just in Germany, are there certain countries that it's good to go just to tweak the parameters on, learn from that, and then scale up to the larger countries? In the US, we always talk about launching in Canada first, so we can test it out. It's a smaller scale version of the same market. How does that work in Europe?
Europe has different interesting test markets. One of the test markets we're pretty much looking into at the moment are the Scandinavians, because they are small countries, they usually have high monetization averages, and they're very easy to smart boost. So these countries are pretty excellent to drive. The funny thing about Scandinavia is that everybody in Scandinavia speaks almost perfect English, so we're seeing quite good conversion rates even if you don't localize to the app to the local language. What we're also seeing that many advertisers are asking us, if we're localizing an app to Germany, should we test run Austria or Switzerland? Which I personally believe sounds like a good strategy, but it's also very risky because specifically Switzerland is a very volatile market. Because so many developers are trying to go that strategy, you might end up in a situation where 5 or 6 guys are trying to boost Switzerland at the same day, which eventually will end up everybody's bidding against each other. So it is very troublesome, and I think that Austria is a little bit better. What we're also seeing is, obviously you mentioned Canada as a test market. Australia is quite sought after at the moment. And then we're seeing many developers, especially games developers, going into Singapore, Malaysia, and sometimes Hong Kong to test their apps. And obviously, I think that's a smart strategy. We can currently boost confidently in more than 33 countries. So if we have a specific country where you want to test run it, we're more than happy to discuss that.
We have another question?
How can you separate the countries? Because like AppTicker, for example, cannot separate between countries. When you want to boost only in Austria,
yeah.
What will you do?
Some platforms can separate countries, some can't. In some cases, you will need to just live with it. AppTicker, for instance, is is sold at a very fair price, so you can just live with that. But obviously, you need to track that, and our tracking can very well separate clicks and downloads from the specific country, so we can reallocate them to providers such as AppTicker or all the other ones. It's a difficult task, but it's feasible.
And one more question: you said Apple counts 1.2 after an update, or?
That's what we see in our tracking. It appears to be that way. Obviously, we're tracking all the different campaigns, and we're trying to find out how many downloads do we need to acquire to drive a certain ranking in a specific country. And we're seeing that it's much more effective if we're doing that on the day after the update. Obviously, that strategy does have a certain risk attached to it. Obviously, if you do run an update, you're never 100% sure if it's free of bugs or if the changes that you've made to the app are considered well by the users. But if it's just about driving acquisition costs, that is a valid strategy.
And a boost will best work after an update.
Sorry?
Then the boost will best work after an update.
Yes and no. It depends on your strategy again. I'm not so much a fan of doing one, of taking one strategy and plugging it into all the apps I'm seeing. I prefer more to look into the app more deeply and also into the changes that you're planning with an update before I make that decision. That's actually the decision that we're not taking, we're just offering you that and saying, look, if you're planning an update, it might be worth thinking about that. But we have seen cases where the client has decided to go that strategy and has made very bad experiences because in some cases, for instance, if you're changing the way users need to register for the app, that might be a small and slight change, but in the example I'm thinking of, users replied to that very badly and they punished the app by giving them very bad ratings. So that's something you need to be aware of, and even if the changes you're making by a new release are small, I suggest to think about that strategy very carefully. Because once you've launched a smartBoost, it's hard to stop it. It's like an avalanche.
So I have one more question. Is there a day which is best for boosting a game? For example, on Wednesday it's the best day, or Sunday?
I love that question because again, that's a question that depends on the app, that depends on the market, and so on. So what we're seeing is that in the big markets, think UK, US, and also Germany to some extent, also France. And we're seeing some very high activity on Thursday and Friday because the theory behind that, if you're up in the rankings on a Friday, then you have the full weekend in order to harvest the organics, which obviously is something that's very interesting for games because they depend on casual users. For other apps, and sometimes even for games apps, I rather suggest to think about Tuesday or Wednesday, or probably even Monday, and really think about is it worth the extra costs that you need in order to get up on a Friday against paying a lower cost maybe on Monday or Tuesday? Because on Monday or Tuesday you may need less downloads and the traffic to buy those downloads is cheaper as well. So it's very, very well worth thinking about that.
Thank you.
Okay, one last question from me before we wrap up. It's hard to mention boosting without drawing analogies between Lance Armstrong or something else that goes by. If we look at the top charts, what percentage of the top charts have got there organically through just natural skill, and what percentage of them are now boosted to get up there in the first place, in your opinion?
Whoa. When it comes to games, to be very honest, I think it's 90%, actually 100% of all the apps that got up there using some sort of doping. The difference is that we're not talking EBO or I don't know what the stuff that Lance is taking is, but it's actually legal. And it's only fair to do that. when it comes to other apps, there are some who come up there by organic growth. And obviously the one thing that's the most valuable type of promotion you can receive is obviously Apple recommending your app something. Unfortunately, that's
hard to get.
Very hard to get.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
And before I get that question, no, we can't help you getting featured by Apple.